Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to HC Live. We are here, obviously, at the Houston Chronicle, covering all things all the time. Today's topic is very exciting. We're going to be talking about all things floodplains in Houston, from the political to the environmental, all of the key players, the key issues at hand in this very extreme topic that is, covering our city and our region daily, weekly, you name it. So I want to make sure first to introduce myself. If you don't know me, my name is Colleen Baker. I'm a producer here at the Houston Chronicle, and we've got great panelists with us today. We have Jim Blackburn, who is an environmental lawyer and professor with Rice University. We also have Sam Brody, who is a coastal environmental planner at Texas A&M University and has several appointments academically and professionally as well. And we want to ask you all to start submitting your questions live. Let us know where in Houston or in the region you are tuning in from. Are you in the Upper Kirby area, maybe like Sam, or near Ion, downtown like Jim, or are you at the Galleria area, maybe like Caroline and myself? And start submitting your questions for our experts. And I want to make sure, can everyone hear me? Yilun, are you there? Excellent. Do you want to go ahead and take it away? I see we've got Memorial area, Richmond. People are starting to chime in with some comments about where they are. So I want to make sure we get everything squared away. You want to take it over?
Of course. Well, thank you, Colleen. And hi, everyone. My name is Yilun Cheng. I am an investigative reporter with the Houston Chronicle. And I am so excited to talk about flooding with you today because, as everyone here knows, if you live in the Houston region, you're going to encounter storms and flooding at some point, more likely. Whether it's Harvey or Imelda or the countless smaller storms. Flooding is really an issue that impacts so many families' quality of life. It impacts their finances, their sense of security. Yet our reporting shows that builders have continued to put up homes inside floodplains. You can find our full investigative series on HoustonChronicle.com under my author page, and we'll continue to cover this topic. So please feel free to send any tips, thoughts, comments my way. But today we have three amazing panelists with us, and we'll dig into why people keep building in floodplains, what the risks are, and what home buyers and homeowners can do to protect themselves. I am joined by our deputy data editor, Caroline Ghisolfi. We worked on many of these stories together, and she is intimately familiar with the data. And then we have with us Dr. Jim Blackburn with Rice University and Dr. Sam Brody with Texas A&M University at Galveston. Thank you all so much for being here. I know we only have 30 minutes before we turn to audience questions, so we'll dive in right away. Well, Caroline, just to set the scene a little bit, could you walk us through what our main data findings are and what trends stood out to you about how and where we built since Hurricane Harvey?
Well, sure. Just like you said, the greater Houston area really has seen some very devastating floods. Chief among them, Harvey, saw trillions of gallons of water pour onto the city. It made scores of deaths, and it caused about $125 billion in damage. Yet none of that seems to have discouraged developers in this area from building in areas that are prone to flooding. And with that, I mean areas that are either directly in floodways, essentially where water flows the fastest during a storm, or areas that are in the 100-year or 500-year floodplain. You may have heard these terms. They essentially mean that area has a 1 in 100 or 1 in 500 chance of flooding on any given year. And those are areas that actually sometimes can see flooding happen way more frequently than that. But again, that doesn't seem to have discouraged developers from continuing to build in those areas. We took a look at Harris County, Galveston, Fort Bend, Brazoria, and Montgomery County. And we looked at all the properties that had been built since Harvey in the 8 or so years since. And we found that 65,000 new developments have been added in these areas that are prone to flooding, that are potentially very dangerous. And of those, about 57,000 were single and multifamily homes, meaning that they may now be occupied by people that don't really understand the kind of risk that they're running, not until their insurance premiums go through the roof or they start experiencing really, really bad damage to their homes, their home values dip, or God forbid, they start seeing their homes actually go underwater. So that's why we took a look at these numbers. Of course, in an area like Houston, you can expect growth. That was not surprising to us, but the sheer scale of it, especially after such a tragedy like Harvey, really has been quite interesting.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And the reason we wanted to look at post-Harvey building trends is, many people saw Harvey as a turning point, and there seemed to be a consensus afterward that we shouldn't build in floodplains anymore. So why are we still doing it? Dr. Blackburn, do you mind starting us off?
Well, I think one reason we're doing it is because it is not illegal. It is legal to build in floodplains. There are requirements about elevations that have to be met. There are, if you will, risks that at least appear to be known. Now, I don't want to jump ahead, but I would say that my biggest concern is I don't think our floodplain maps are accurate. The current floodplain maps I think are way out of date. We're trying to get new maps from Harris County Flood Control District. They have been slow to come because it's not easy to develop these new maps. The technology for mapping is evolving, and they're trying new types of computer models that are proving difficult. But I would just say, in general, we see development because it is legal and because we do not emphasize as a community the risk of flooding to the extent that we should. And I just think that's an across the board statement. There's a lot more to be said about it, but I will let it go for that right now. But generally, I think that it's a big mistake.
Dr. Brody, what do you think? Why do we keep building in floodplains despite known risks?
Jim's absolutely right. It is legal, and the driving factor for development is often land value, proximity, and marketability. So the flood risk issue is not baked into decisions to develop. So the combination of, where is land the most affordable in places like the floodplain, which has historically either been left alone or is chronically flooded. So the combination of financial incentive with the legality and emphasis of building in the floodplain with elevation requirements that need to be heeded to, we're seeing a lot more buildings placed in harm's way. And the one thing else I'd add is property tax. Texas does not have a state income tax. We know that property taxes are the main driver for local infrastructure projects, revenue to jurisdictions in general, so that every parcel that is has a taxable value, there's a huge incentive to realize the best use case for that parcel, which is often development, not protection.
You both made the really good point that they do it because it's legal. And actually, while I was doing my reporting, developers often say they follow all the rules and regulations and actually mitigate the impact of their developments through things like, elevations and detention ponds. So what they built really shouldn't worsen flooding in the area, but we all know it's a little more nuanced than that. Dr. Blackburn, even when projects meet all the legal requirements, do they still end up increasing flood risks for the region?
Oh, I think absolutely for several reasons. I think the biggest one is the 100-year rainfall is increasing. It is changing. And that is something that we really haven't come to kind of to deal with as a community in any, I don't think, public manner. Behind the scenes, the new 100-year floodplain maps will be based on about 17 inches in 24 hours rather than 13 inches in 24 hours. But those of us that have looked hard at these kind of believe that the real number is up at 23, 24 inches in 24 hours, just because we've seen storms that big several times in the past. So my biggest concern is you may be building to the correct elevation today, but you will be flooded in the future because we basically see these rainfalls increasing. And I think we're going to see more and more water going into these floodplains. They are the drains. That's where the water is going to go. Gravity is pushing them there. It's physics, and it's the most dangerous area to build. And I just don't think we're telling the buyers the truth about the risk that is there.
Dr. Brody, do you have anything to add? How do these developments affect the larger floodplain dynamics in Greater Houston?
So I would add that the biggest vector for risk and impact from flooding in the Houston region is the human-built environment, in addition to weather patterns. And there's two ways that the built environment generally is exacerbating flood impacts. First, putting people in harm's way. Jim is right. Like, our first line of defense is avoidance. Do not build in the known, even if they're inaccurate, the maps are accurate enough to know that, not to put structures in floodways or floodplains, however outdated they are, which is true. The second is building creates what's called impervious surface, parking lots, roadways, rooftops, where the water can't penetrate into the ground. Instead, it runs off into the nearest drainage area. And all of that added impervious surface is doing a couple things. It's changing the natural drainage system and the way water flows across this very flat landscape. And we get a lot of unintended consequences, like water in people's bathrooms or bedrooms. And the second is, despite retention and detention requirements, more volume and velocity of water is running off these large paved areas or roofed areas downstream. So that development in Katy is impacting flooding downstream in Houston. Development of a neighbor is impacting potentially your individual home, particularly if that neighbor has a new structure in place for a bunch of reasons. So without going into launching into too much detail, the pattern of the built environment and the spread of impervious surfaces across the landscape is really causing more flooding and impacts downstream. It's not just putting people in harm's way. And all that development is creating a situation where we're not just building in the floodplain, but the floodplain, as we measure it, is moving into us.
That's very well said. We're not just moving into the floodplains, but the floodplains are actually moving into us. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how, home buyers and homeowners can protect themselves. Caroline, you know the data inside and out. When someone is thinking about purchasing a home and tries to do their homework, where can they look first to understand the property's flood risk? What data is available to them and what data isn't?
Well, the agency that collects and releases data on flood risk is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Some people here have referred to it as FEMA. FEMA does have maps that show you where the risk is highest for individuals, for properties. The problem with those maps, as both Dr. Blackburn and Brody have said, is that they're outdated. In this area, those maps haven't been updated in several years, meaning that the data is probably out of date. They're based on out of date data, and they may not be portraying accurate risk to residents. Now, they are still the best information we have right now. So you should still use these maps to get a sense of where risk may be highest. But something to be very, very cautious about is those lines. What the maps may suggest to you is that if you're on one side of the line, you're at risk, and if you're on the other side of the line, you're not. Now, it's really not that black and white. See that more as a blurred line. And if you're close enough to an area that may be at risk, think about how you may want to protect yourself. Now, at the Houston Chronicle, we have pulled in this data from FEMA. We've made it available to you all. We've explained what different things mean. Something that we have also done is to try to fill some of those information gaps that have been left mostly by the fact that FEMA has not updated these maps in a long time. And we've done that by adding some historical data to our maps and overlaying it on top of what FEMA has already made available. So if you go on our website, you can see the FEMA maps and what FEMA says is at high risk and isn't at high risk, but you can also see which areas saw moderate to extreme damage during Harvey that may help you understand if your home is at risk. You may also just want to talk to your neighbors. Unfortunately, the government right now collects a lot of data. It does not make very much of this data available, but there is a collective memory that you can rely on. So going door to door and trying to understand who has and hasn't flooded and how bad that damage was and how much money it cost may still be a weapon at your disposal today.
Right. We often heard from people, who bought into brand new neighborhoods only to find out later that their homes are vulnerable to chronic flooding. But actually after Harvey, the state strengthened its flood disclosure laws, and Dr. Brody here actually drafted that legislation. Dr. Brody, could you explain to our audience what's improved for buyers since Harvey, and if there's still any gaps that make it difficult to piece together a property's full flood history and risk profile?
Yeah, so you may not realize, but Texas has the strongest flood risk disclosure law in the country right now. And that came after Hurricane Harvey, where the state wanted to make as many sweeping changes as they could. I was very vocal about the importance of providing information at critical points in time, and that one of those is when you buy or sell a home. Um, so the new disclosure law makes a requirement that when you do sell a home, you have to report whether it's been flooded, if it's in not just the 100-year, but 500-year floodplain, whether it's in a reservoir pool. It really did set the standard, raise the bar for flood risk disclosure in this country, but that wasn't enough at the time. I can't tell you how many times after a local talk, someone comes up to me and says, well, I'm not in the floodplain. I've lived in my home for 30 years. I never flooded, and now I've flooded 3 times in 3 years. So those comments and other issues led us to create a system called buyersaware.org. And it's meant to complement and inform the state flood risk real estate disclosure law. And buyersaware.org, which is one of the tools in the Institute for Disaster Resilient Texas, is essentially Zillow meets risk. Why can you see your school rating in Zillow and your crime statistics in Trulia, but you can't see your flood risk in the most flood-prone impacted city in the country? And what we set out to do was create an interface where anyone can put in their address or click on a parcel across 41 counties right now in Texas, and get a complete report on flood risk, insurance requirements, and a list of things a homeowner can do to reduce their risk. So we're not trying to necessarily dissuade someone from buying a home. It's going into that purchase with eyes wide open and understanding what can be done to reduce the chances of a devastating flood event. We report past flooding. We report development, past and future. It is, I'm sure, the most accurate way to understand flood risk, even if you're miles from the floodplain. And the reason is we're using new models, new data that isn't tied to trying to use physics to determine where the water goes, but it's tied to the impact. We don't care where the water goes, we care where the impact is. So we're able to use the best research from National Science Foundation and the best models and convert that on a platform in a way that's interpretable and actionable. So it's buyersaware.org. And we do report FEMA floodplain, but we also report much broader and more accurate flood risk. It is supported by FEMA, and is the primary public-facing flood risk tool for the state, funded by the Division of Emergency Management. So we're hoping to expand it to all counties across the state, and we're constantly improving on how we can predict floods.
Buyers aware, everyone. It's an amazing tool.
Shameless
Everyone should
advertisement.
check it out. You can just put in your address, and all this wonderful information shows up. And at the Houston Chronicle, like Caroline mentioned, we've also put together resources and maps that you can, put in your home address and see kind of what the flood risk is for your property. But we also know that there are gaps in information data out there right now. And for some people, it's just about asking the right questions. Dr. Blackburn, what are some questions a prospective home buyer should ask their realtor or developer? Could you give us kind of like a practical checklist of all the information they should ask for?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think, again, it's not only so much asking for the information, but also listening and hearing. I mean, what Sam has talked about setting up is, for example, a disclosure system on your real estate forms and things like that. But a lot of times what we hear is the seller, you know, well, it flooded, but Harvey was a very, very big storm. It's not going to happen again. You hear representations that try to minimize the risk. And I'm not even so sure it's questions as much as it is taking this information that you're getting, because what Sam's talking about is excellent information, but we're not getting a consistent message about that information. For example, after Hurricane Ike, there was a warning system that was put up in the Clear Lake area, which would show how high the surge was from a Category 4 and a Category 5 storm. And that marker was removed after 2 months. And it was removed because it interfered with real estate sales. Now, that's not the message we should be sending to our would-be home buyers, that we care more about selling houses than we do about talking about the flood issue. So what I'm saying is the buyer needs to be probing hard about this issue of risk. And I'm afraid that a lot of our buyers coming in from other parts of the country are expecting to be protected by government. And our government here doesn't see its role that way. Our government is much more about working with developers than it is about keeping people out of the floodplains. You don't hear our governments talking negatively about it. I can remember Mayor Turner being emphatic about the need to develop floodplains. Well, when you get message like that coming out of your government, and engineers are supposed to have as their primary duty is their duty to the public. Now, lawyers are supposed to have a duty to their client, but engineers are not. Engineers' primary duty is to the public, but most engineers do not undertake that duty to the public as seriously as they do protect their clients. And I think that's a real problem. So it's not so much that they're questions. I mean, you can be told that you're in the floodplain, but if you're told you're in the floodplain, but don't worry about it, but this, but that. So I think that the real problem is trying to get the message to penetrate. I think that information is out there, and certainly the tools Sam has helped put together are among some of the best tools in the country. But if someone doesn't know to go to that site, I don't know that the government necessarily tells a buyer. I don't know if the realtors tell the buyers to go to Sam's site. Getting the information to the public and getting it to penetrate, I think, is where we have failed most emphatically here, because we don't treat it as serious of an issue as it is.
Right. That's a really good point. I know you've often talked about how, as a culture, we haven't really fully come to terms with the reality of climate change and realize that building inside floodplains or in flood-prone areas is a serious problem. No, thank you
And we
so
don't
much.
and we don't talk about it. I
We
mean,
don't talk about it.
we don't publicly talk about the fact that our climate is changing. The rainfalls are going to get worse, that wherever the floodplains are, they're going to grow. You don't hear that message coming out of our governments. You don't hear it much anywhere. And I think those are the types of reality checks that we need.
For sure. And in one of our stories, we actually explored how money and politics have enabled tens of thousands of new homes to be built inside floodplains since Harvey. A lot of these big developers and engineering firms are powerful donors locally, and some of them are um, regularly network with local commissioners and county judges who set the rules on where and how developers can build. And Dr. Blackburn, you mentioned that we are in this culture where we're prioritizing kind of growth and real estate sales over flood protection. That's kind of a larger cultural issue that we have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also are in a state that is very protective of private property rights. And so we don't encourage as a state regulation. It's just not in our DNA to regulate a lot of things. And this is one that we need to regulate. And I think we're going to have a real realization at the state level that some of the rules regarding floodplain development are going to have to change because we have favored the rights of the landowner, I think, to too great of an extent in the floodplains because those damages are to all of us. We all end up paying for the losses that occur in the floodplains, and we're going to pay again and again and again. I want to see us evacuate floodplains as opposed to develop them. And evacuation is not something that you hear a lot of talk about, but it's something that I think we're going to have to see in the future.
Very fair. Dr. Brody, I know when you and your wife went house hunting some years ago, flood risk was a top priority for you. Could you share that story about how you vetted potential homes and what our audience can maybe learn from that?
Sure. So this was another story that gave rise to buyers aware system. And I do want to go back and address one of Jim's points he just made because I think it's super important. So we moved to Houston in 2017 from Friendswood, and um, I don't know a lot, but I know a lot about floods. Looking for homes that we thought were affordable. We moved to Houston for our children's education. Um, we looked at a bunch of homes, and my wife, who we've been married for 26 years, and she knows a lot about flooding too. She's like, okay, we're not going to live in the floodplain. We found a home. She said, come look at this home. And, it's got new floors. It's been just painted. The walls look new. And I pulled up to the neighborhood. I was like, honey, this home has flooded multiple times in the last year. I know we're miles from the floodplain, but different circumstances has led this neighborhood to be chronically flooded. That's why it's being flipped with new floors and shiny new appliances. And she said, well, how was I supposed to know? It's your job to tell people. Um, and that's what gave rise to this system. And the other issue, just to circle back on, and I'm still here. So we ended up buying a home. All the other homes flooded except the home that I bought. And she would joke that I was out there in the street measuring the crown of the road to the front door, and I was obsessed. And turned out um, I got lucky, and we had Hurricane Harvey 3 months after. Uh, and really, it was for me looking at, you have to dig for this stuff. Looking at the relationship between your front door and the crown of the street in front of it, looking where the street drains, assuming you have them, are on the street and keeping them clear, looking where there's retention and retention ponds upstream or up the street that will then collect water and slowly feed it down. I even looked at the width of the pipe under the road because the larger the diameter of the pipe, the more water it can carry, the larger the storm drain, And generally, it's the more up to date it is, the larger the opening is that can accommodate the water. And so all these kind of tips and tricks I wrote down, haven't shared them yet, but there's a lot of things a homeowner can do to recognize risk. A home buyer can understand risk even beyond buyer's aware. They're not always that expensive, and a lot of them are behavioral. My biggest pet peeve is to keep the storm drains in the street clear from debris. That is the difference between water in your home and water just in the street. Um, but just to circle back, another reason that we created Buyers Aware and why I sometimes am very frustrated is um, what Jim was talking about. There's not just a gap in communication, there's distortion, intentional distortion. One example was after Hurricane Ike. In my own struggles to get Buyers Aware platform adopted locally, 9 times out of 10, a good realtor wants transparency. They want the data to be, spread out there and communicated. But there are very strong interests that, for all the wrong reasons, do not want Buyers Aware to be around because it shows it's a very honest, revealing look at actual flood risk based on data at the parcel level back to 1972. I mean, we have data that no one else can have, and we're using it, I think, for the good of the communities. But to say I don't want my Be Aware score listed because it's going to lower my property value when I sell the home because I don't want people to know the property is at flood risk, I think is really problematic because they're passing on that risk to home buyers, and that home buyer gets hurt, and then the community gets hurt in the long term. I don't know why every local real estate organization is not sharing Buyers Aware or similar websites which are out there widely. I should note Zillow, which is the largest platform in the country. They do have flood risk. Not Buyers Aware, but they have it's called First Street Foundation, which also looks at climate change, which we don't look at necessarily or directly. And so this distortion of communication, the data's out there, but trying to hoard it and not let it be shared to inform buying and selling is going to hurt the marketplace over the long term. And so I get frustrated when I see that happening. So my plea is that if you go to a realtor or real estate platform and you don't see the best and latest flood risk data, ask yourself, is this the right place for me?
Yeah, and let me just add real quickly to what Sam has said. All of the things that Sam talked about are things that I did as well. And we built our house, and I got Phil Bedian from Rice to come over and design the drainage systems and make sure that we were high enough above the street. There's a lot of things like that you can find out, but you have to know to ask. And I think that's the big point here, is that we do not emphasize enough that you need to investigate these issues. And if you're coming from Iowa or you're coming from the Midwest or particularly the Northeast or the West Coast, where the government is much more aggressive about protecting the buyers, you make the assumption that if it's okay with the government, it's going to be okay. And you really can't make that assumption in our part of the world. And it's more of a buyer beware type of environment. And I just don't think we tell our new arrivals enough about how to protect yourself. So I would say it is not so much knowing the tips so much as knowing that you need to investigate beyond, and then you can find the information to ask for.
Right. And we do have a lot of new arrivals who were not here during Harvey. And as I understand the reality of flooding, how bad flooding can get in the Houston region. So I appreciate that. And I see that we have some audience questions. Colleen, do you want to take over and guide the Q&A from here?
And I'll direct the first question actually to Caroline, because this one's really specifically about where the money flows too, right? And we've already touched upon that quite a bit at length. But if you could give a shorthand for where does the money ultimately go if it's not in fact, to Jim and Sam's point, benefiting us, where is it ultimately ending up?
Well, we definitely found when we were looking at where this development is happening that a lot of names kept popping up over and over and over again. And those were the names of home builders that are pretty prevalent in Texas and beyond. Some big names that you may have seen on lots of real estate. They were building a very large share of the homes that they were building overall in a year. They were building in the floodplains. They are allowed to do that again because, like Dr. Blackburn said, it's legal, it's allowed. But the consequence of that is that you'll have home buyers that may lose the biggest investment of their lives, while developers are getting richer and richer because they're allowed to build in areas where they can build for cheap. And once the property floods, they can move on. So we are seeing certain entities, again, entities that, as Yilun said, and as a lot of her reporting has shown, are very politically connected, that are exploiting some of the loopholes that are in the system.
And I'll add that, we looked at a decade of campaign finance reports in Harris County and Montgomery County, where a lot of this floodplain development has been happening. And we found that some big developers and engineering firms have donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to their local officials, which, we're not necessarily saying that there's anything improper going on here, but some advocates and experts I talked to worry that that helps create a larger culture where the industry's interest is prioritized over flood protection and residents' safety.
Yes, and someone else is actually also asking, are the financial institutions extending loans to buy the homes in these areas on purpose, or is it maybe that they're not aware, or is it maybe a combination of both? And I'll start with, I guess, Dr. Blackburn on the legal side, if maybe to unpack that a little more.
Well, I just think, again, there's a lot of times these buyers coming in from out of state or not from the Houston area make assumptions that if a house has been built, if you got a building permit, if you went through if you will, the regulatory process, that things are okay. And I might add, FEMA is part of this problem. I mean, flood insurance is available for homes in the floodplain. This is a part of the system. It was the Flood Insurance Act was passed back in actually comes from the late 60s, and then there was an act in the early 70s that required insurance for mortgages. And that required that all of the local governments like Houston and Harris County joined the flood insurance program in the 73, 74 time period, just so they could enable the availability of flood insurance. That is then required to get a mortgage. So in a way, I mean, FEMA is complicit in this, in that they basically authorize building in the floodplain and then ensuring floodplain development. But also, it's important to know in Houston that much of our flooding is outside of the mapped floodplain. And I think this goes to another point, which is these maps are not that accurate. This is where Sam's information becomes so important, where you check about what happened, because if you're outside of the floodplain, you still may be in a very high flood risk area. It just doesn't technically qualify as a floodplain. In the new maps that are being done by Harris County, they're going to experiment with kind of showing flood-prone areas that won't be regulatory, but that will identify areas where water pools away from the creeks and rivers. Our floodplains are really about rivers and creeks coming out of their banks and flooding adjacent areas, as opposed to just an area being poorly drained. So, there are some real limitations to what these floodplain maps reveal. There's some real kind of limitations to what certainly the FEMA system protects.
I would add, and I would direct viewers to go see some of the amazing reporting that my colleague Alexandra Kanik did in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. What it shows is that tens of thousands of properties flooded that were not even near the 100-year, 500-year floodplains or the floodways. We saw exactly the same thing in Kirk County when the big Central Texas floods happened. Tens of thousands of properties that flooded outside of the floodplains. This is what outdated maps does. It shows risk that may not be accurate.
Historically, in Houston, almost 60% of all the losses are outside what was then the 100-year floodplain. And they're out of date and the modeling needs to be improved, but I think it's much more than just, a better model, a better rendition. When you're getting chronic flooding miles away from any of these boundaries, you really have to start looking more at the built environment, whether it's sound walls, uh, mini mansions built in place of a 1950s rancher with 4,000 square foot of roof, draining directly into the street that's stuck in the 1970s in terms of drainage, right? I mean, there's lots of issues here. We're changing. We cannot keep up with, if we want to measure the 100-year floodplain, we cannot keep up with delineating that because the growth is happening so quickly. Every time the shovel hits the ground, some nuance changes in drainage and stormwater flow, which will change the boundaries of these floodplains. So we need to stop thinking about the FEMA floodplains and thinking about risk more broadly. Um, the other problem is the whole mechanism is geared towards that floodplain. All the regulation, all the education, all the insurance requirements. So if you're a foot out of that boundary, you're treated as if you're 1,000 miles away on top of Mount Everest. You have no information, you have no reconnaissance. Again, that's the Institute's role for the state, is to come up with solutions to that at a regional level. Um, and so the other bottom line is the whole system is misincentivized. The home buyer um, gets distorted information or no information at all, is inheriting risk that others create, and is oftentimes tied to that property for 30 years. And so we're setting up a system that is creating pain for a lot of people. And again, Houston is its landscape, its traditional geographic landscape and development patterns make it the most flood-prone city in the country and the fastest growing. So I agree with Jim. It's time to really rethink the way we're doing things, and rethink not just these specific issues of communication but the whole system in general needs to be reconsidered. The state of Texas, after Hurricane Harvey, made a billion-dollar commitment, multiple billions, on making the state more flood resilient, whether it was disclosure, flood watershed, flood planning, and all these other things they've done. They want that information out. I think the localities need to see that and perhaps be inspired to also do the same.
And I would throw out these problems are magnified in lower income areas because, again, so many of the problems that you have in the upper middle and middle class neighborhoods, oftentimes they do have storm sewer systems where you have oftentimes open drainage systems in the lower income areas. But if you don't have the culverts cleared under the roadways, your drainage system just doesn't work. And there's not much attention paid to those types of issues. And so there's a lot of, I think, maintenance issues that we can do better. But I agree with Sam and kind of what we were saying. There needs to be a different approach. I think we can say that we are failing. I mean, and I'm not being particularly critical of the flood control district or the commissioners or the city or anyone. I just think the system that we have is not serving us well. And it would be a wonderful time now, I think, to rethink how we look at flooding, how we think about it. There's been talk about making room for the water. Well, we need to give water more room. I think that's clear. We're not doing that. I mean, I just think there's some common sense things that we can do differently that would make a big difference.
On that note, someone in the chat is asking, are there physical measures such as barriers just to even stop a few inches of water from coming into a house in the event of a major happening like Harvey? Dr. Brody, you were saying you've seen people flip houses for this reason. Is there anything other than barriers that people could be doing, like Dr. Blackburn said, on the smaller side as well?
Yeah, there are portable barriers out there, and we're working with a Dutch organization that um, can provide those, and we're testing those out. There are all kinds of portable barriers. There's also what they call wet proofing techniques, where you're raising your utilities, you're raising the outlets, right? It's not incredibly expensive to do that. There's dry proofing, where you're using materials and sealants that keep the water out, right? If you buy a home, right, a lot of stuff goes into buying a home. It's not just floods, it's the kitchen and the proximity and your school district and everything else. Um, so you can buy a home that's at risk, but reduce the risk. Uh, some of it's behavioral. Um, Move your valuables to a second floor or an attic space. Um, it's keeping the gutters, if you have gutters in your home, clean, which I honestly do a bad job at, or keeping the storm drains on your street clear, which I have been told I'm too good at that because I'm always out there with a broom sweeping my neighbors' storm drains. Um, it's the combination of all those things. There's no one quick fix. It's kind of this synergistic, uh, this recipe of success, and it's different for every home. The most expensive thing you can do is to elevate homes, and we see that. We see ranch homes elevated 9 feet high after Harvey, costing more than the house itself. Um, but realize while you're removing the home potentially from flood waters, it creates all kinds of problems. I have a friend, maybe listening, who did that and now has what's called swinging piers, because the compaction after the elevation, the piers that the home was on, right? That Houston is also one of the fastest subsiding places in the country. Um, Now the home is unstable, or the garage, when we elevate homes, is still at slab on grade, which drives me nuts because that is the second biggest investment you'll make. And in Houston, you need a car really to get around. And so I'll see these $2 million homes, elevated, huge homes, and the garage, the expensive car, and is sitting at ground level. That's going to flood. And so if you have a home, even that's elevated, pay attention, because your car, and we had 1 million cars flood in that one event, Hurricane Harvey, 1 million cars, is really susceptible. And so now people are using these hydraulic lift systems, right? That's a wealthy person's problem, I guess. Or they're moving their cars in advance to higher ground. So I agree with Jim. It's, the first thing to think about is staying out of harm's way. Do not build in places we know, we have the records, we have the data that chronically floods. And then we do it, we rebuild and expect a different outcome. I just don't think that's productive in the
Right.
long term. And as Houston's growing, um, the problem's gonna get worse. Even since Harvey in 2017, I wonder if we did the analysis, if Harvey hit again today, um, would that storm be more impactful, cause more losses? Where would that be? That's something we can do. That's what scientists do. What if? And I think that would go a long way in convincing the regional decision makers on, how we're loading up the risk and what the consequences are, because we're going to get another Harvey. I don't know if it's next year or 100 years from now, but it's going to happen. And whenever it happens, its impact is going to be exponentially worse.
Yeah, let me just jump in and say, Sam raised a really good point, and I think it goes back to our original premise about all of this new development in the floodplain. Because even if your house is elevated, you're going to have to live with that flooding. And I mean, I've represented over the years a lot of people that had been flooded. I represented them legally, trying to help them get some type of damages or relief or things like that. And I had a lady call me and said, you know, Mr. Blackburn, I get hives every time I hear thunder. And I said, oh, yeah? And she said, yeah. She said, I've got to figure out where my kids are. I've got to, you know, if I'm at home, I've got to get out. Will I be able to get back? Probably not. I've got to know if I can pick up my kids. I've got to know about all of these arrangements about living in the floodplain, in an area that floods. I mean, we know these people will flood. Now, their house may not go underwater, but they will be living with flooding. And I don't think we educate anyone about how you live with flooding. What do you have to do to prepare? Do you evacuate every time that we have a big rainstorm coming? Do you just like Sam was saying, do you park your car somewhere out of the floodplain or what you think is out of the floodplain? Do you walk back and forth? All of that is about living with water. And, you know, frankly, we ought not to be living with water, but that's the reality we're creating. And I don't think we tell people what they're getting